enormous pleasure for me to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Katherine Galloway Young. Young is a scholar whose diverse interests and relentless intelligence embody the very best of the humanities and humanistic social sciences. I initially encountered Young's ideas through her first book, Tale Worlds and Story Realms. Let me just take a moment to say why this book is so remarkable. In the 1970s and early 1980s, folklorists and linguistic anthropologists had done extensive and highly sophisticated work on the semiotic mechanisms by which storytellers and their audiences switch back and forth between forms of talk oriented toward the social interaction of the storytelling event and forms of talk like reported speech that are situated in the fictive worlds of their narratives. What was missing from this literature, however, was an analysis of the structures of lived experience that those semiotic mechanisms gesture toward. That is, what was missing was a phenomenology of the narrative event, narrated event, and the complex ways that people move back and forth between those domains in experience. This is precisely the terrain the Tale Worlds and Story Realms explores. Penetrating in its insights and evocative in its language, the book yields perspectives on expressive culture that are truly revolutionary and, I would argue, have yet to find an equal in contemporary scholarship. Now, another, less adventuresome scholar would probably have worked on the phenomenology of narrative for years to come, and quite rightly, as this is a deep and vast topic. But in the early 1990s, Young's restless mind was already moving on to other areas. In 1993, Young challenged the field of folklore studies with the publication of Body Lore, a book that placed the problem of embodiment at the very center of the discipline and continues to shape wide swaths of the field today. Of course, all this work might be unfamiliar to those who know Young as an important medical anthropologist, whose Presence in the Flesh, The Body in Medicine, published in 1997 by Harvard University Press and translated 2 years later into Italian, offers unique insights into the phenomenology of health and illness. And if that's not enough, Young's most recent publications have explored the role of gesture in expressive culture. Young's work in these diverse areas has received wide recognition. Her articles have appeared in a range of journals that includes the Journal of American Folklore, Journal of Folklore Research, Body and Society, Gesture, Semiotica, and Journal of Narrative and Life History. She's taught at the University of California, Berkeley, the University of Pennsylvania, and New York University, among many other institutions, and has given invited lectures at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, the University of Bergen in Norway, the Center of Excellence in Cultural Theory at the Universities of Tartu and Tallinn in Estonia, the University of California, Berkeley, UCLA, Indiana University, and Ohio State University. She regularly gives papers at AFS, the AAAs, and the International Society for Gesture Studies. She's been a fellow of the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences and has received grants from both Wenner-Gren and Carnegie. The title of her talk this evening is Scrape, Brush, Flick, the Phenomenology of Sound. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Katherine Galloway.
Too good. Good evening. That was an inordinate introduction. I hope I can live up to it. Scrape, brush, flick, the phenomenology of sound. Sound brings forth space. John Hall, who is blind, describes rain. Rain has a way of bringing out the contours of everything. It throws a colored blanket over previously invisible things. Instead of an intermittent and thus fragmented world, the steadily falling rain creates continuity of acoustic experience. I hear the rain pattering on the roof above me, dripping down the walls to my left and right, splashing from the drain pipe at ground level on my left, while further over to the left, there's a lighter patch as the rain falls almost inaudibly upon a large leafy shrub. On the right, it is drumming with a deeper, steadier sound upon the lawn. I can even make out the contours of the lawn, which rises to the right on a little hill. The sound of the rain is different and shapes out the curvature for me. Still further to the right, I hear rain sounding upon the fence, which divides our property from that next door. In front, the contours of the path and the steps are marked out, right down to the garden gate. Here, rain is striking the concrete. Here, it is splashing into the shallow pools that have already formed. Here and there is a light cascade as it drips from step to step. The sound on the path is quite different from the sound of the rain drumming into the lawn on the right, and this is different again from the blanketed, heavy, sodden feel of the large bush on the left. Further out, the sounds are less detailed. I can hear the rain falling on the road and the swish of the cars that pass up and down. I can hear the rushing of the water that flooded the gutter on the edge of the road. The whole scene is much more differentiated than I have been able to describe, because everywhere there are little breaks in the patterns, obstructions, projections, where some slight interruption or difference of texture or of echo gives an additional detail or dimension to the scene. Over the whole thing, like light falling upon a landscape, is the gentle background patter gathered up in one continuous murmur. Now that was the inspiration for me to think about sound. We enter, as you hear, into an audible architecture. A world thickens around the perceiver as he hears. Sound does not suggest itself to Hull as it does to the sighted as bodiless, diaphanous. On the contrary, a hitherto unencumbered emptiness condenses into materiality around Hull's ears. Rain makes present not just the great hollow of space into which Hull's body is inserted, but layers, serried ranks of objects, one behind another, which open out around him. We get depth perception, that putatively unique province of vision. I taught a course at San Francisco State with a colleague of mine on film, and we did what we call the deaf-blind experiments. The students all had to either wear a blindfolded or wear earplugs, and they had to go out in pairs, as it were, the deaf leading the blind speaking for the deaf. And the project was not to have the experience of what it would be like to be blind or what it would be like to be deaf. As any disability theorist will tell you, it's a shallow mockery. It was to have the experience of the audible in the absence of the visual, and the visual in the absence of the audible. I participated in the experiment with my colleague, Peter. We both went out, and when we came back, we wrote up our journals of this experience. This is from my journal. On the first outing, I'm deaf, Peter is blind. I lead him down a long hall. My heel bone thunks against the hard floor and vibrates up through my skeleton into my ear bones. I feel this sound inside me as an echo of movement. But the echo of movement that usually sounds off the walls and the ceilings has gone out. My movement fails altogether to animate the world as I walk. I am no longer in tune with it, no longer welcome. There is no longer for me any audible difference between inside and outside. Inside, the flat surfaces of the wall press up against me visually. Outside, the flat surfaces of the ground tip away from me visually, but inside doesn't feel cozy and outside doesn't feel spacious. It's more like they have no feel, just a look. The flowing bodies walking through the square, eddying around standing pairs of people conversing, gesticulating, they're pantomime bodies. Their gestures, which are seamlessly integrated into talk when I hear, stand out as if they were conducting a performance. Gestures unspeeched look so improbable. Suddenly, I am extremely bored. The visible world has no anticipations and no aftermaths. I realize how dependent I am on the sounds of things to announce their imminent appearance, to trail behind them after they pass. Coming before the objects they prognosticate, they create a little suspense so that the actual appearance of the object provides a little satisfaction. Coming after it as it leaves, the sound of things gives them a sustained presence, even though the things themselves have popped off. Now we switch roles. I'm blind and Peter is deaf. Blindfolded in the parking lot. Space comes alive. I come alive. The rail I'm leaning against vibrates to the sounds that leap into existence around me. Audition and vibration are deeply connected. We step out. I have a sensation of activated space, deep and shallow protrusions, looming presences overhead, moving forms to one side or another, an audible architecture experienced not so much as sound, but as space. As we walk, the whole structure resonates overhead, underfoot. We step out. A cold breeze brushes my left cheek. There is no question about the difference between interior and exterior space. Outside, I feel vistas on my skin, uninterrupted distance falling away to the left. But it is not as if the inside is closed off. Auditorily, the parking lot has perceptible structures, or rather presences, thin substances, not walls, ceilings. Floors, of course, are now tactile anchors, not audible, not visible. Loomings, hauntings, pressures of air. What in the visual world is solid, opaque, in the audible world is vaporous, hallucinated, structures of air. Peter leads me inside into a large space with different angles, different edges. It's an interior theater. Its sounds descend upon me from above, hanging at various altitudes. A low-pitched, rhythmic rim of sound circles 2 stories up. A soft beat, not a drum, not a machine. What? It lasts throughout all the other episodic sounds punctuating the space of the theater. I feel as if I walk in among instruments, deep strings, trills of piano-like notes, hums, fragments of tune coming from various sides. We exit this envelope of sound and move into yet another space. An aria, soprano, a single phrase, afloat above and from the side. Still, the soft, almost pulse, almost clack rim of sound circling above. Instead of a building, I am inside an architecture which mounts above me in a facade of sound. I am no longer, it's textured, filigreed, some stories retracted, others thrust forward, angled in from the side. I am no longer interested in the insistent, remote materiality of visible buildings, but in this theater of the air that takes over interior space. Okay, so the phenomenologist of sound, Don Ide, points out the horizon of the visible is the invisible, the horizon of the audible is the silent. But the 2 perceptual realities overlap so that we see what is beyond the horizon of the audible, and we hear what is beyond the horizon of the visible. Each sense makes perceptible the other's imperceptible limit. Ide writes, what may be taken as horizontal or absent for one region is taken as presence for the other. In ordinary perception, film people and ordinary people all know this, the visual absorbs the audible. My sense of space is spacious, for the most part, is an oral sense. But until I am deprived of it, I attribute spaciousness to sight. Audible space has a different constitution, of course, from visible space. Its perceptible objects are highly elaborated and at the same time imprecise. Even as I hear the shape of space, I subsume my experience under the visual. If you blindfold yourself, I don't know if you know this, and walk towards a wall, you'll stop before you hit it because your body will recognize the exact echo of getting too close. Try it sometime. I, of course, in my ordinary way of life, pay no attention because I've already seen the wall. Hall cultivates this sort of recognition. In the earliest stages of his blindness, he goes blind very slowly over many years, Hall sensed presences, large objects looming, as the sighted would say, up around him as he moved. When he first became aware of this sense of presence, he would wave his cane about and discover that he was coming up to a large tree. At first, lampposts were imperceptible, too thin. But as he practiced his new auditory acuity, even thin presences became perceptible. Hall writes, I gather from conversations that this experience is essentially acoustic and is based upon the awareness of echoes. It's a form, of course, of echolocation. This certainly fits in with my experience, but at the same time, it is important to emphasize that one is not aware of listening. One is simply aware of becoming aware. The sense of pressure is upon the skin of the face rather than upon or within the ears. That must be why the older name for the experience was facial vision. The faculty of hearing to materialize in architecture grounds Michael Brewster's sound sculptures. Brewster writes, "You can't make sound hard and solid, but you can make it seem to stand still, as if hovering in place, so that you can walk around inside its acoustic structures. Sustained sound in a room with good echo can appear to us as an archipelago of audio sensations of space. Standing still, sound is a dimensional substance you can move through without hitting your head on anything. It's real good material for sculpture." Now I'm going to play you one of Brewster's sculptures. That's Brewster's audible sculpture of Harry Bertoya's blue whale. And you can tell. You can tell what it's made of. You can tell whether it's hollow or solid. You can tell everything about it from Brewster's sculpture. Brewster writes, "Walking through it in its resonant state provides an experience similar to perusing a landscape, but from the inside with all of your body, instead from the outside with just your eyes. It shows us the near field. Like a solid, it had volumes, edges, planes, fullnesses, flatnesses, roundnesses, and hollows. The works. It comes fully equipped to elaborate our experience sculpturally." The inhabitation of space by the ear extends, of course, to audible landscape. Alain Corbin, the social historian, writes about the hold that bells had in the French countryside before the French Revolution. An auditory synchronizer, he says, the bell told its listeners when the market had opened, when the tax collector had arrived, good thing to know, when a flock had set off for the mountains, when the wine harvest was declared, when the community's bell was present, sometimes they had migratory bells, when work on the roads had commenced. As a consequence, a subtle auditory rhetoric was developed. A bell had to have its own language, which varied from one commune to the next. The whole of the French countryside is studded with bells, each bell with its own tone. Before the French Revolution, the authority the bells sounded was, of course, held by the Catholic Church. By constructing their architecture of air and descending upon their hearers, the bells issued their command of space and time as from on high. Within aerial space, Corbin writes, over which it still held a monopoly, This bronze voice, falling from above, hammered home the injunctions of authority. The revolution, the Nouvelle Regime, in order to take over authority in France, raised the bell towers, melted down the bells, and destroyed the churches in the name of rationalism. The consequence of this is they destroyed the audible landscape, which was, audible landscapes are instructions for perceiving, just like visible landscapes. We read them. If we're prepared, Corbin argues, to allow that a landscape is fundamentally a thing that is read, a way of directing one's gaze, or of being prepared to listen, the slow obliteration of the landscape that had been delineated by the village bells preceded the bells' towers falling into silence and rack and ruin. Once the affects that a landscape expresses and the aesthetes who perceive them are gone, there's nobody left to read the directions. This heralds what Corbin calls the genesis of meaninglessness. All landscapes under transformation are undergoing this obliteration and genesis, and of course the awakening of new meanings. In contrast to visible space, audible space is kinetic, mutable, materializing and dematerializing. It's perhaps this motility that accounts for our feel for it as evanescent or hallucinatory, as if its objects had a less dense reality. All sound is movement. John Hall writes, it was a world of nothing but action. Every sound was a point of activity. Where nothing was happening, there was silence. For the blind, the world is void unless something moves. Nothing in Hall's world holds still. If it did, he wouldn't perceive it. So these strange presences that press in upon the sighted from all sides, as surfaces of things, are for the blind intermittent materializations. Hull inhabits a world that constructs and dismantles itself as he moves. Hull continues, the intermittent nature of the acoustic world is one of its most striking features. In contrast, the perceived world is stable and continuous. The seen world cannot escape from your eyes. There are no gaps in the visible world, no empty spots where nothing is. The visible world is replete. The audible world is episodic, and yet this very intermittency gives auditory effects power. Hull writes, I hear the distant tossing of trees across the park. It comes like a wave rolling across a beach. Now it breaks upon my body in a squall, a gust like a fist. This is very exciting because of the anticipation and the wonderful feeling of having the knowledge in your body of what's going on. For Hull, the wind's body, muscular and massive, conjures up out of thin air those enormous presences we see looming over us, trees. But our trees are earthbound, rooted and trunked. His are hitched to the upper airs by their tiny sound makers, leaves. In Hildegard van Westerkamp's audible composition, Sensitive Chaos, we hear how objects move in space. We perceive audibly which direction things are coming, going, or rising and falling. Let me play you a moment of that. Make it go on here. Right? It's possible to parlay the power of sound to bring forth worlds into an imaginary architecture, not a world projected on a surface that stands before me visually and that by the same token stands away from me visually, but one that I inhabit. Kurt Corath reports on a conjuring act for children in a library. And now, he writes, the smiling librarian, a new record in her hand, goes up to the gramophone. The little room is filled with the breathing of a man, as loud as if a giant is snoring. Then the narrow walls seem to fade away. A landscape appears, enlivened by the prattling and splashing of rushing streams. Then cars go racing through the tiny room, rumbling omnibuses and little rattling tin lizzies. A storm crackles and thunders by. Noises of the stock exchange emerge and turn into children's voices. We hear the wheezy organ on the merry-go-round and the subdued roar of the fair. Again, space dwindles to the size of the room, and suddenly, invisible hands begin brushing clothes, crumpling paper, blowing noses, and then, in bewildering contrast, the walls extend into a factory with machines stamping and engines humming. Harbor noises surge up and mills creak, and so it goes on almost indefinitely. Laughter of girls, growls of rage, battle cries, trains puffing, drum rolls. The young lady smiles again, conscious of the astonishment in store for the listener. An entire zoo, with its thousands of voices, appears. Monkeys scream and chatter. The walrus snorts, the polar bear yawns. Deer bell, dogs of all sizes and breeds bark. The tiger growls, the lion speaks its mind. A pig grunts, bees hum. The birds trill and whistle and sing, from the canary to the nightingale and the kestrel. The homely sound of crumpling paper can command the imagination as vividly as this phantasmagoria of mutating worlds. Philip Corner provides instructions for an installation he calls ear paper, or papers. I quote the entire set of instructions. An environment set up with one or more suspended pieces of fine-sounding paper, already crumpled, already listened to, ready to again for any ear, parenthesis, disposable, renewable, written in the margin, may be varicolored, and on the facing page a black and white photograph of a crumpled paper surface, a vertical dotted line along the inner edge, and an image of scissors cutting. You could make one yourself. Sound is the result of moving two surfaces against each other. The crushed paper bears the trace of what sound artist Laurent Chasse calls betweenity. Betweenity, she writes, is membranous, immeasurable, and momentous, so barely made out of the minimal duration, the slightest sliver of space. A thing needs to be said to have had a life at all. Relentlessly, I go about touching the world, trying to get something of myself across. All we are ever up against are surfaces, yet we endlessly imagine and work to evoke an essence, to pry loose an inside from the rigid world of others. Often, the paper that has been placed between things is left marked with faint trajectories and whirls, is patterned, perforated, wrinkled, stained, frayed, or torn. When a rubbing results with the paper in relief, a dimension has been added to the betweenity, making it a place of its own. Sound, too, is betweenity. There needn't be a paper, a membrane. Sound itself is crushed between surfaces. The sound we hear in Westerkamp's composition is not the sound of a thing moving. It is the sound of a thing moving against another thing. No thing makes a sound. All sounds are made by two things. The onomatopoeia of the words scrape, brush, flick retains the texture of this touch. As Ide notes, I hear not one voice, but at least a duet of two voices. Stephen Connor, literary theorist, writes, when one hears a sound, one never just hears one thing. One hears the sound of contact, of echo, reverberation of one thing against another. Any sound is always two. One never even hears a particular commingled sound, a footstep, a punch, a shot, a shout. Alone and uncommingled, One hears the sounding of a sound in a particular environment, the sound as it has been touched and retouched in the acoustic context through which it has spread, and which has imparted its own particular qualities to the sound, bleaching out certain frequencies, dampening or sharpening the attack or decay of the sound, desiccating or liquefying its timbre, emaciating or doubling it in reverberation. There is no pure silence to be heard. As sound historian Jonathan Stern puts it, sound is a little piece of the vibrating world. Seeing is directional. Visual space always opens out before my eyes. If I move my eyes, visual space still opens out before my eyes, even if it's a different visual space. But the space behind me disappears. Space has a circumambient rim, visual space, that I cannot see past. The visual world is, of course, replete, no blank spots, no tears, but objects are piled up in it, one behind another, so that the field of objects is always layered. The objects behind are always hidden by the objects in front, or partially hidden by the objects in front. Vision opens up the space between my body and objects and separates me from my visual experience of things. Even my own body presents itself to me visually as an object whose surface conceals its interior. Hearing, by contrast, is multidirectional. Sound opens up behind me the space that vision occludes. We wouldn't have a behind but for the auditory. We would be falling into the abyss behind us all the time. What I hear does not depend primarily, as vision does, on how I turn my head. Even if I catch sounds from different directions, they still surround me. Whereas the visual world is replete, always filled up, the auditory world is intermittent. There are always regions of silence. Nor do sounds pile up or occlude one another. They blend or modulate. In contrast to vision, to which my body presents itself as a closed surface, sounds announce to me my own interior. Not only do sounds vibrate within me, but also I make my own internal sounds. The visual world is nothing but surfaces. Audition reveals the interiors not only of bodies, but also of objects. Touch is not so much multidirectional as enveloping. The tactile world presses itself right up against my skin, so that sensations are at once sensations of the body and sensations of the world. I can no longer distinguish myself from objects. They refuse to distance themselves. Unless I'm touching them, they become tactilely imperceptible. Instead of jostling each other in visual space or melding into each other in auditory space, objects jostle me. I configure my surface to their exteriors, and I feel what they are as my own skin. Tactility returns me to surfaces, but to the surfaces of the body, which are intermingled with the surfaces of the objects that they touch. And of course, just as I make internal sounds, I feel internal sensations. Smell dematerializes objects, not into visual or auditory ephemera, but as it were into essences of themselves, which the body sucks into itself, transgressing altogether the boundary between body and its object of perception. Like sounds, they blend and mutate rather than separate themselves from each other. They're not quite directional. They cloud or gather rather than emanate. Unlike visual or tactile objects, though, they take up space. Olfactory objects have no surface. Like tactile objects, they mass, but unlike them, they both envelop the body and the body envelops them. As with all the senses except vision, the olfactory world is episodic. Smells wax and wane, drift in and out of existence. Taste, of course, materializes its object again, but the object nonetheless transgresses the boundaries of the body. Indeed, in the case of taste, the object becomes body. In perceiving it, I engulf it. Gustatory objects are the only perceptual objects the body destroys in the act of perceiving them. So though gustatory objects have a thick materiality, what taste appreciates about them is the essentialized properties that the body's assault upon the object releases. Like sounds and smells, tastes blend, and such directionality as they have is not somewhere outside the body, but located within. Vision is extinguished as soon as its object hits the surface of the body at the eye. Taste and smell die just under the skin, but touch and hearing travel inside. Here is the secret of the senses. Each sense opens onto a different reality. All the senses open onto the same reality. Each sense opens onto a different reality. All the senses open onto the same reality. This is the paradox that phenomenology solves. The senses are synesthetic. Synesthesia is the capacity of one perceptual experience to evoke the experience of another sense. There are, of course, synesthetic metaphors, which may be how some of you know the term, literary people know the term, like loud colors. The source domain for the metaphor is sound, and the target domain is sight. So that's a synesthetic metaphor. You're mixing perceptual systems. However, there are human beings who retain a synesthetic experience such that one perceptual experience actually triggers the other perceptual experience in the body. For instance, Richard Seidowitz, who works with synesthetes, met a woman who she heard a siren while he was talking to her, and she screamed. She said, this is terrible. I'm seeing 3 red lightning bolts, brilliant red, going up to the left. So in synesthete's case, the sound actually causes the perceptual experience of something visual. All infants are born synesthetic. The Canadian neurobiologists, Daphne Moore and Katherine write, the newborn does not keep sensations separate from one another, but rather mixes sights, sounds, feelings, and smells into a sensual bouillabaisse, in which sights have sounds, feelings have tastes, and smells can make the body feel dizzy. Paul Schilder, the Viennese psychoanalyst, argued in the middle of the 20th century already that there does not exist any primary isolation between the different senses. Isolation is secondary. You have to learn to distinguish one sense from another. We perceive, Schilder writes, and may with some difficulty decide that one part of the perception is based on optic impressions. The synesthesia is therefore the normal situation. The separation of the senses is not a natural endowment, but a learned faculty. In most humans, cross-modal perception disappears as they begin to explore the world corporeally, and they lose their synesthetic faculty. What happens is the proliferation of neural connections that connects up all the different sites of sensory reception in the brain prune back over the course of infancy and separate out into separate sensory systems. In the few people in which this doesn't happen, they become synesthetes. They remain synesthetes all their lives. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenologist, thinks that it's only because of trace synesthesia in the body that despite their perceptual disparities, all the senses open out onto the same world. He writes, the senses intercommunicate by opening onto the structure of the thing. One sees the hardness and brittleness of glass, which is a tactile quality, by the way, and when with a tinkling sound it breaks, this sound is conveyed by the visible shards of glass. Because of the body's intersensorial unity, he calls it, the look of the thing is already telling you what the rest of the thing is like, or what the thing sounds like, or what it looks like. Any single sense perception portends the whole of the thing. So in the course of our ordinary engagements in the everyday world, we are absorbed in our acts. What Merleau-Ponty calls the arc of intentionality runs through the body, space, objects, and others. It is the unreflective perceptual modality he calls motor intentionality. In it, I do not think and then act. I act without thinking. It's how we go about everyday life. You want to go outside, you just decide to go outside and you go outside. You don't have to think about how to put your foot down on the floor, how to orient your body, how to tip forward, how to figure out what the doorknob is, how to angle the hand, to twist it. You don't have to figure anything out. All of that's in your habit body. It's and it's the arc of intentionality. It's already hooked you up to the floor, to the knob, to the outside world before you ever start. That's motor intentionality. Perception is agnostic as to modality. The world, ordinary engagements don't care which perceptual faculty you're using. You're still just getting a real world. That's motor intentionality. If I turn my attention to a particular sensory experience and thematize it in consciousness, as phenomenologists put it, I switch to the reflective perceptual modality Merleau-Ponty calls representational intentionality. In this mode, I think about what I perceive, and doing that is one of our great pleasures. In classical music concerts, for example, not only are other sounds muted in the interest of thematizing the music, but also lights are dimmed to mute vision, bodies are stilled to mute touch, food and drink are prohibited to mute taste and smell, and the requirement for formal dress may even have as one of its effects a further inhibition of both movement and smell. This produces what the folklorist Barbara Kirschenblatt calls a single sense epiphany. Single sense epiphany. It's one of our great pleasures, these, but it's not how life ordinarily is. It's a unique departure from our ordinary engagement in the world. Merleau-Ponty writes about the reality that music opens up. When in the concert hall I open my eyes, visible space seems to me cramped compared to that other space through which a moment ago the music was being unfolded. And even if I keep my eyes open while the piece is being played, I have the impression that music is not really contained within this circumscribed and unimpressive space. It brings a new dimension, stealing through visible space, and in this, it surges forward. Just as in Victims of Hallucinations, the clear space of things perceived is mysteriously duplicated by a dark space in which other presences are perceptible. The musical architecture, by which I mean the space the sound carves out, exceeds the visible dimensions of the hall in which the music is played. It creates another space that paradoxically takes up the same space. Music, Merleau-Ponty writes, is not in visible space. It besieges, undermines, and displaces that space. Sound, Stephen Connor writes, has no frame. There's nothing to hold it in, so there's nothing to hold it in. Although each sense opens onto the real, one sense does not neatly fill in the gaps in the other senses. It all doesn't fit together into reality like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Each sense pulls on, pushes against, distorts, intensifies, shrinks, or expands the others. This resonant incommensurability of the senses gives perception its depth, its richness, its inexhaustibility. Objects present themselves as horizons of possibility rather than completed things. They portend what they do not yet present. This portentousness is what gives the perceptual world its accent of reality, in Alfred Schutz's term. There is always more to it. Sound is not suspended in space between vibrating bodies. It gets under my skin. I perceive it as both a disturbance in the air and a disturbance of my tissues. The audible world is at once episodic and pervasive, outside and inside the body, impalpable and felt in the bones. Connor writes, one apparent paradox of hearing is that it strikes us at once as intensely corporeal, sound literally moves, shakes, and touches us, and mysteriously immaterial. Perhaps the tactility of sound depends in part on this immaterial corporeality. Because of the fact that all sound is disembodied, a residue or production rather than a property of objects. When we see something, we do not think of what we see as a separable aspect of it, a ghostly skin shed for our vision. We feel that we see the thing itself, rather than any occasion or extrusion of the thing. But when we hear something, we do not have the same sensation of hearing the thing itself. This is because objects do not have a single invariant sound or voice. How something sounds is literally contingent, depending upon what touches or comes into contact with it to generate the sound. We hear, as it were, the event of the thing, not the thing itself. To begin with, my own voice vibrates within me. It accrues body. Thought, spoken, is fleshed and boned. Douglas Kahn, who's a media scholar, writes, while other people hear a person's voice conducted through vibrations in the air, the person speaking also hears her or his own voice as it is conducted from the throat and mouth through the bone of the inner regions of the ear. Thus, the voice in its production in various regions of the body is propelled through the body. Its resonance is sensed intracranially. A fuller sense of presence is experienced as the body becomes attached to thought, as much as the generation of speech is attached to thought. Yet at the same time, Kahn continues, that the speaker hears the voice full with the immediacy of the body, others will hear the speaker's voice infused with a lesser distribution of body, because it will be a voice heard without bone conduction, a deboned voice. Where bones once stood, there will be only the air within which the voice's vibrations dissipate. Lee Eric Schmidt, who's a religious historian, points out, once the assumptions about the passivity of hearing, in contrast to the activity of seeing, are critically engaged rather than presumed, hearing's capacity for a similarly spirited interchange becomes recognizable, a dialogic movement between speaker and listener, a sympathetic vibration between sounding bodies. It's possible, that is, for the voice of the other to vibrate within me as does my own. And if it does, I am entered into such intimacy as to extinguish difference. And I want to conclude by reading to you an account by the poet Douglas McClure, who invented the term meat language for his poetry, his conversation with the leopard at the zoo. She puts her face within an inch of the wire and speaks to me. The growl begins instantly and almost without musical attack. It begins gutturally. It grows in volume and it expands till I can feel the interior of her body, from which the energy of the growl extends itself as it gains full volume of fury. It extends itself vibrating and looping. Then, still with the full capacity of untapped energy, the growl drops in volume and changes in pitch to a hiss. The flecks of her saliva spatter my face. I feel not smirched, but cleansed. Her eyes are fixed on me. The growl, without a freshly drawn breath, begins again. It is a language I understand more clearly than any other. I hear rage, anger, anguish, warning, pain, even humor, fury, all bound into one statement. I am surrounded by the physicality of her speech. It is a real thing in the air. It absorbs me, and I can hear and feel and see nothing else. Her face and features disappear, becoming one entity with her speech. The speech is the purest, most perfect music I have ever heard. And I know that I am touched by the divine on my cheeks, on my brow, on the tympanums of my ears and the vibrations on my chest, and on the inner organs of perception. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a truly remarkable talk. That was an amazing talk. Thank you so much. We have time now for questions, both from people here in the gallery and from folks over the internet. Who would like to start out? Perhaps something from the gallery tonight.
I don't really have a question exactly, but I just wanted to ask you about extremes. So extremely loud, extremely bright, extremely hot. If you could, I don't know, talk about the way that we instinctively protect ourselves from those things, for example, perhaps, and how that relates to the more like music and speech and so on.
Okay, that is a really hard question, Jay. It's a question of attention. Attention is one of the great mysteries of phenomenology. It's the first thing Merleau-Ponty talked about. How do we pay attention? And the question is, does the world grab attention? Does something force us to pay attention to it? Or do we volitionally turn our attention to something and bring into the foreground of the flux of phenomena that surround us certain kinds of things on which we focus? We do what he calls thematize it in consciousness. And it's not clear exactly how to tell what's going on there. but it looks like we are all culturally educated bodies who live in audioscapes with which we are deeply familiar, such that their sounds, however uneven, don't catch us on the hop, don't startle us, don't cause us pain. Although if we were in an exotic space, all sorts of things in strange spaces suddenly announce themselves involuntarily, and we are involuntarily forced to pay attention to the world. So it seems to have to do with the difference between the ongoing habitual bodily attunements to familiar audioscapes and the disruptions of familiar audioscapes with unfamiliar events. But it's not clear that that means that there are loud sounds or painful sounds or difficult sounds, because for many people, what I think is a loud sound, I've noticed with my kids, what I think are horrifyingly loud sounds, that's just how they listen to music, it turns out. Intolerable. I mean, really, how do they live over there? I don't think there's a rule about, what it takes in loudness to grab somebody to make them pay attention. I think I think we're talking about, culturally educated bodies and the habitual practices of the bodies, and it's pretty clear that what your concern here is not loud, soft pain, but defamiliarization, unfamiliarity. What it is, something quite, a whisper might catch you if you're alone in the dark and you're terrified in a strange hotel somewhere, right?
This is kind of maybe a bit of a long form question.
Okay.
But the way I perceive sound, music, things like that is, there are two bodies. There's a space between. It kind of reinforces this. Then we were talking about sight and how it hides things behind it, like what you were saying today. It kind of conceals the visual structure. But that kind of got me thinking that because of the whole movement idea, that it's not maybe so much that I hear an environment, the environment reveals itself to me, but only through touching my body, through touching my ears. The light must touch my eyes before I can perceive it. So yeah, I don't know.
That's a very funny use of the word touch.
Exactly. So what I'm thinking is touch. Right. So then what's touch in all this? I can't hear someone behind me until that sound touches me.
Okay. Aristotle said, it is perception that makes the animal, and the first perception is touch. Aristotle thought touch is the fundamental sense. Even, the eye is an evolution of the skin. And the eye still has in it, according to neuroscientists like Vittorio Rizzolatti and Galese, it still has visuotactile receptors. So the skin can still a little bit respond as if seeing. And we have, visual tactile spaces around the body, which the brain registers as visual tactile spaces. For instance, you have one around your head, you have one around your whole body, you have one around each hand, so that the hand perceives its space and the brain registers it as if the hand were seeing. Independently, it has it inside of its own contour. So and the phenomenologists used to call seeing anticipatory touch. The reason animals the seeing was useful for animals is only because we move, right? Tactile kinesthetic world of moving. But we have the interesting capacity to figure out what we're going to move into before we get there. That's what vision is for. So I think, you can take my course in the anthropology of sound, of the senses. Touch is, in certain ways, absolutely fundamental, and it's the least investigated, I think, of the senses. So it's very interesting. And of course, you notice this. It's not as if these domains are not absolutely separated from each other. There are vibratory characteristics to soundings, which are, as it were, tactile in the tympanum, and so on. So we should look at that. That's a very interesting question.
Thank you. Yeah, I should read Aristotle.
Well, I have a question, if you wouldn't mind. Your discussion of the way everyday mundane perception is a unity of the senses, and then these rarefied realms focus on one sense or another, I think that's just perfectly right on and fascinating. I guess my question is to take that into situations of imagination. When you have when you imagine an image in your in your mind, when a composer hears sound in their head, do we think that that is primarily intersensed in the way mundane perception is, or do we think that imagination tends to be more monomodal?
Okay, let me just think about this thing. Both memory and imagination are ways of making present absent realities. And so far as we can figure out, it turns out that visual memory is very easy. Most of us, people are really good at it. In fact, great novelists like Thomas Hardy write whole passages of the visual in which you can feel where the breeze behind the chair is moving around the back of the room. Sound is harder. There are people who are pretty good at imagining or remembering sound, but it's a cultivated expertise. Virtually nobody can remember taste or smell. Instead, smell triggers memory, and the memory that it triggers is visual and sometimes auditory memory. So my feeling is we should be looking, that's another thing we have to look at differentially in terms of the imagination, sensory imaginations. It doesn't come out even. It doesn't come out that you have a full world with all the sensory input from all the aspects of the senses. Tactilities, that's interesting. We have tactile imaginations, particularly, for instance, in dreaming, which is another altered state. Memory and imagination are both altered states of consciousness. And in dreaming, it's predominantly visual for most people. It has, although for blind people, by the way, it goes dark in certain ways, or for some blind people, it retains the visual world and that they've lost in the real world. It sometimes has audition, and it has tactile sensations, particularly it's sensation when you're flying. You feel the lift off of your body, or when you're falling, your foot suddenly catches at the bottom of the bed. But you don't usually smell or taste things. So it looks like those senses are not as available to imaginary acts, and yet they work the reverse. Tastes and smells bring forth memory and imagination, even though we don't produce the memory. We don't really, when you smell something, you're not remembering the smell. It makes you remember a world, your childhood, Marcel Proust's Madeleines and tea with his aunt, which produced 12 volumes of the remembrance of things past. These are all really fun questions, and everybody should be thinking about the senses and the complexity of the senses. It's a very interesting field.
I almost wonder if rather than thinking of mundane perception as inherently polymodal, and then these rarefied domains of it's more like a continuum, that we never, even the most mundane situations, have complete multimodality experience.
No, we switch all the time.
We're kind of moving back.
I've exaggerated the contrast there. Ordinarily in everyday life, every now and then, we suddenly pay attention to something.
Right. Yeah.
Or we decide to pay attention to something, or we become absorbed or fascinated, and we reflect upon our very moment of fascination. Absorption and fascination are actually the opposite. Absorption is when you're listening to the music and you're lost in it. And fascination is when you're trying to make out every possible contour and figuration in it. And those are really different experiences, because the absorption, your sense of yourself disappears. It's a form of motor intentionality. But in fascination, your attention to the characteristics of the phenomenon that you're examining is reflective, thoughtful, conscious, at the surface, as opposed to simply taking your body in with it.
That's wonderful. We've got a question in the back.
How do you see phenomenology as it relates to, say, the increase in, say, the upsurgence of, say, ASMR channels on YouTube.
What's ASMR?
Autonomous sensory meridian response. It basically,
Now let's explain that to me, Spencer.
oh, basically, it's essentially you put on headphones and certain sounds are fed from left to right, and it's supposed to essentially evoke a sort of a physical response through pure sonic means. And it's not necessarily dialogue but usually is, and it's recorded specifically using a binaural headphones, a binaural microphone.
Right. So each ear hears slightly differently,
Yeah,
which is how normal hearing works. That's how you
Yeah,
can
exactly. It's meant
orient
to
direction.
recreate that and then
Yeah.
reproduce that in a presentation form. Do you feel? Do you feel that this would be sort of like a grassroots study of or take on phenomenology?
The fact of the matter is, you can use hearing as a directional sense instead of using vision as a directional sense because the ears are binaural. The virtual world that's being conjured up by having slightly different sounds in each ear of the same reality. They're not dissonant or anything or incongruous with each other. Surely it's going for the immersion of the ordinary. And yet, it's forcing you to thematize it in consciousness. So it's both immersive and reflective, which is an unusual combination. That might be why it's interesting, that it echoes the ongoing unreflective absorption in just the ambient sound world, and yet you're paying attention to it. I think it's a very peculiar, it's kind of a curious practice. It's denaturing something, which is probably why it's fun.
Well, that's all we have time for this evening. Thanks once again to Dr. Young, as well as to our social media host, Dr. Megan Forsyth, video director Spencer Crew, camera operators Jing Cha and Jordan Zalis, and all of you for coming. If you've missed any part of tonight's talk, you can watch it on our YouTube channel, where it will be posted in the next few weeks, and where you can find other videos of center events. I'm Harrison Berger, wishing all of you a good evening. Thank you.